Welcome everyone to TomcatCon London, and what I hope is the first of many small conferences like this. It's great to see you all here today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mark Thomas. I'm a committer and PMC member on the Apache Tomcat project. I do various other bits and pieces around the ASF as well, helping out where I can, but I get to spend the bulk of my time working on Tomcat. My day job is with a company called Pivotal, and I have what I think is one of the best job descriptions in the world, which is go and do whatever you think is best for Tomcat. And that's what they let me get on and do, so it's great. So I'd like to start off by saying a big thank you to LifeRay. Today just wouldn't have been possible if LifeRay hadn't stepped up and provided us with this venue. When you're organising a conference like this, the thing you worry about is, okay, the biggest cost is the hotel or whichever venue you're going to be at. How am I going to cover that cost? Because I don't know how many tickets I'm going to sell, or whether in fact I'm going to sell any tickets, but the hotel wants the money in advance. So LifeRay took all of that worry away from us by stepping up and saying, look, don't worry, we'll provide the venue, you worry about everything else. So a big thank you to LifeRay for doing that, because without it I really don't think this could have happened. Also like to thank C2B2. They very generously bought a couple of tickets, which of course helps our sales, ran a little competition for a couple of people to attend, and they also gave us some cold hard cash to pay speakers' expenses and microphones to record things with and stuff like that. So that again has been very helpful. Thank you to them. And finally, my employer Pivotal and Jean-Frederic and Remy's employer Red Hat have donated their time so they can be here to speak to you. So a thank you to them as well. What I want to do in this State of the Cat presentation is start off with a bit of a retrospective, look back at what's happened in the Tomcat community over the last year-ish, and then look forward to what I think is going to be happening in the next year-ish. Now, in terms of forward-looking, this is very much my personal view. Where I've got a sense of what the community is thinking, then I'll pass that on. But ultimately, where Tomcat ends up is going to be a community decision, and I'm just one voice in that community. So I might get it completely wrong, but I will try not to. So community being very important, let's start there and what's happened in the last year or so. We've got two new committers, Michael and Emmanuel. Michael's been helping out with the native code, and Emmanuel is the Debian maintainer for the Tomcat packaging. So that's been quite useful to improve the communication between Tomcat and the downstream packages. On the PMC front, Coty and Huxing have joined us. Coty works at Red Hat, again does some Tomcat packaging work, so he's been feeding back fixes that he's come across in his work, and Huxing works at Alibaba in China, so they're making extensive use of Tomcat, and as they come across interesting little problems at the scale they operate at, he's feeding those fixes back into Tomcat as well. So in total that brings us to 18 committers and 26 PMC members. You'll notice that a higher proportion of PMC members are active compared to the committers, and that's for the simple reason that if any committer is active for anything like a reasonable period of time, they get made a PMC member. So that's why the PMC members have got the more active proportion. Now, slightly unusually, I'm also going to mention trademarks, which is odd when I'm talking about community, you might think. In terms of what we've managed to do in the last year, Tomcat is now a registered trademark in both India and the United States. We have registrations pending for China and the EU, and we chose those markets because that's where we saw the biggest use of Tomcat and the biggest potential growth. Don't ask me what's going to happen with EU-wide trademark registrations and Brexit. We don't have a clue. We'll cross that bridge as and when we come to it. Hopefully it will all just carry on as it is. Probably not. We'll probably need to jump through a few hoops, but we'll deal with that as and when. Now, the reason we've actually done this is twofold, and they're both to support the community. The part of being able to build a community is to be able to clearly identify it. And so we want, when people think Tomcat and Java web apps, that they're thinking of our project, not some other copycat project. And having a trademark helps us protect that identity, so that when people talk about Tomcat, they are talking about our project. The other thing it helps us do is occasionally organisations that are using Tomcat or building stuff for it or working with it or building a product on top of it, they tend to cross the line, and they'll start to refer to things as, I don't know, say Foo Company Tomcat or Foo Tomcat, and that's going too far. That's the sort of thing that actually, that makes it look as if Tomcat belongs to that company and is managed and run by that company, and that starts to cause us community issues. So we need to keep an eye out for that sort of thing, and we do. Normally we just ask them to say, look, actually, you can't say that. You need to rename it, and they happily do. Sometimes they don't, or they just ignore us, and that's when things can get a little bit more difficult and can potentially drain an awful lot of community energy. By having the trademarks registered, it makes dealing with those situations a lot easier. For example, if you need to contact Facebook, Twitter, Google, GitHub, any of the big technology companies, and to get them to say, look, we've got this issue with this organisation over here is abusing our trademarks, can you please help us fix it? The first thing they will say is, sure, no problem. Please point us towards your registered trademark. Now, you don't have to have a registered trademark in order to defend it, but all of these technology companies make that the first hurdle. So by having it registered, basically we can just go click, click, click on a form, and then they'll deal with it for us. So it means we can focus our energies on actually writing code and fixing bugs and helping users and doing the stuff that we actually enjoy, rather than chasing trademark problems, which is frankly tedious and not fun at all. So that's why we're doing it. It's just the name that's registered, not the logo. But as I said, the logo itself is still a trademark and it's still protected, it's just not registered. So the name gets the R and the logo gets the TM. So that's what we've been doing on the community side. What have we been doing on the releases side? Well, I'm the release manager at the moment for Tomcat 9 and Tomcat 8.5, and what I've said for those is that I'd like to do a release every month, and pretty much we've managed to stick to that. There's a bit of a gap in February. Believe it or not, that gap is because of Christmas. What happened was we had a release early in December. I went on holiday. We had a whole bunch of bug reports that built up. Then early January I came back, started working them, and because for Tomcat, in fact all of the releases these days, we try not to do a release unless all of the bugs are fixed, which is a nice position to be in, or at least all the bugs we know about are fixed. So I worked through those. We got to the end of that. It was by the end of January the time we got the release done. So we normally do the release at the beginning of the month. Beginning of February, we've only just done a release. Let's wait until we've got a critical mass, and that critical mass didn't arrive until the end of the month. At which point there were more problems that needed bugs reports that needed fixing. We actually got the release out in March. So sort of it was the delays caused by Christmas that fed through into February. You'll notice there were 2 releases in March. From memory, we had a regression. I forget what it was, but something wasn't quite right, so we just did another release. And actually, rolling a release is a fairly easy thing for us to do. The bulk of the effort is in all of us testing it and checking that it's right. The actual physically doing the release takes me less than 5 minutes. I spend more time waiting for things to upload to the distribution points than I do actually building it. The release process is very quick, very simple, very easy for us to do. It's the testing that we all then do to make sure it's right that takes the time. Similar gap in July on the monthly releases, same reason I was on holiday. For 7 and 8, Violetta releases those. Now, because we don't backport all of the features all the way back to 7 and 8, the build-up of sort of critical mass to justify a release sometimes takes a little bit longer. So it works out roughly 2 releases every 3 months-ish for Tomcat 7 and 8. Tomcat 6, that's now end of life. Actually, end of life was back in December, although you'll notice we had 2 releases in March and April. And the reason for that is very simple. Come December, we knew Tomcat 6 had a security vulnerability. Now, we could have just quietly forgotten about it and said, no, it's reached end of life, we're not going to fix it. But that didn't really seem like the right thing to do. So we got the release out, and that actually happened in March. And it also had the same regression that the others had, so we had to do another release, and that happened in April. But that is almost certainly the last release. I say almost certainly because whilst it has reached the end of life, and generally the consensus amongst the Tomcat community is we're not going to support it, if for some reason 3 Tomcat PMC members decided that they wanted to release another Tomcat 6 release, that would be fine. they'd roll the release, vote on it. As long as they've got 3+1s, it can go out. In reality, I don't think it's going to happen, but theoretically it could. Down at the bottom of the chart, we've got Tomcat Native and JK. So Tomcat Native is the native component of the APR native connector. That gets released about every 6 months. It's pretty much feature complete. We had a spike of lots of releases close together when we were adding ALPN support, because we were adding additional features there, but now it's settled down again. And really, it's 6 monthly because it's driven by one of two things. It'll either be that, okay, we've had a few bug fixes and now there's a critical mass of them, or we might have had a new feature and we need a release to use that feature in Tomcat. Or the other option is, because the binaries for Windows that we provide ship with OpenSSL, if OpenSSL has a security vulnerability, then that triggers us to do another Tomcat native release. So they happen about every 6 months or so. JK releases happen a lot less regularly. We did one back in October last year because the build-up of fixes had got to the point where it really seemed like a good idea to do. JK is very much feature complete. There's not much in the way of activity on it at all these days. At some point, not quite sure when, I think it is just going to slowly fade into the background. When it first came out, it was one of the few options to be able to proxy requests from a front-end web server to Tomcat. That was, what, 20 odd years ago. Yeah, the landscape has changed. HTTPD now ships with mod proxy. IIS as either ships with, or you can get add-ons that will do reverse proxying. So the capabilities have changed. The need for mod JK is less. I suspect it's going to fade out, but at the minute it is still supported. And like anything else, if it ever does reach a point where we decide that there just isn't the interest in it anymore, then we'll give at least 12 months notice that it's going away, and give the community an opportunity to say, whoa, hang on a minute, we really need it because. And to be honest, for something like mod JK, it's not a big deal to keep supporting it for another 5-10 years. It's not a great drain on our time. And now the release process for mod JK is documented. It's a lot easier to release. So yeah, Tomcat 6. I bring this up mainly to point out the dates. First release was back in 2006. Last release was in 2017. Tomcat 6 was stable, supported, out there for over a decade. And that, for an open source project, is very unusual. Frankly, for most software, that's pretty unusual, that kind of lifetime. And we've been doing that consistently in the Tomcat community. Tomcat 5 was supported for a similar sort of time frame. Tomcat 7 looks as if it will be supported for a similar type of time frame. So really the message I'm trying to underline here is that Tomcat does come with long-term support. You can, if you pick the latest version, you'll be good for quite a few years. What we always say is that we aim to support 3 versions in parallel. So at the minute we're supporting 7, 8 and 9. I'll talk about Tomcat 10 a little bit later, but as we come to closer to the point where Tomcat 10 is going to be released, that's when the end of life will get announced for Tomcat 7, and then we'll support 8, 9 and 10. But because of the release cycle of Tomcat, it's tied to, major release cycle is tied to Java EE. It used to be the case that you get a release of that every 3 years or so. So the Tomcat releases were about every 3 years. 3 releases in parallel, every 3 years, you get to a lifetime of about 9, 10 years. I'll talk about what's happening with Java EE a little bit later, but broadly, I don't see the overall pattern of the Tomcat support changing. We know users appreciate the long support times, and we intend to keep it that way. I do want to talk a little bit about Tomcat 8.0. End of life for that has been announced. That's June next year. And what we want to do is have people who are currently on Tomcat 8.0 either transition to 8.5 or 9. And if you're transitioning to 8.5, our aim is for it to be completely seamless. So you should be able to upgrade from 8.0 point something to 8.5 point something just as easy as you could upgrade to a different 8.0 release. Now there will be a few gotchas. There will be a couple of places where you'll need to change configuration for that upgrade to be that smooth. That's all documented in the migration guide. If you try it and it isn't that smooth, please let us know. We will either point you to the configuration that you need to use and add it to the migration guide, or add the configuration feature that we've obviously missed. But there is actually one case where we'll say, yeah, sorry, that is going to be a problem, and no, we're not going to fix it. And that's in the BIO connector. So the blocking IO connector is removed between 8.0 and 8.5. That isn't going to change. Now, the only people that's going to affect are people that have basically built custom code on top of the blocking IO connector. And I was talking to a group of people in Miami in TomcatCon back in May who were in exactly that position, and they were trying to migrate to the NIO connector, and there were a couple of things, it was almost working, but they just needed to be able to access a couple of things. So we basically sat down over lunch. They said, oh, it'd be really great if we could do this, this and this. I wrote the code, saying, will that do you? They said yes, I committed it, problem solved. And we can do, okay, it's very easy to do that face to face, but we can do it almost as quickly on the mailing lists as well. So if you are having issues with something migrating to 8.0 to 8.5, let us know. We want to make that a smooth upgrade process. I should say, if you've got any questions as I'm going on, I'm quite happy to take them as we go, so feel free to stick your hand up, jump up and down, grab my attention somehow. I'm happy to take those questions. Things have been quite interesting for Tomcat. Now, I had to rewrite this slide about 2 or 3 times since I first wrote it, as Oracle announced various things that were happening. So, what has happened? Just over a week ago, Java EE 8 has been formally released. That was the 18th of September. And we were waiting for that, so we knew exactly what was happening with the various specifications. The Servlet 4 spec had been released about a week beforehand, and Tomcat's implementation of that is already complete. We're in a really good position with respect to that. Normally, if I look back at where we were with Tomcat 8 and Tomcat 7, the specs were final and we still had implementation work to do. Tomcat with Servlet 4, we're in a much better position. To be honest, a lot of that's got to do with how delayed the Servlet 4 spec was. There were long periods of not very much happening, which meant we could actually implement everything. So some good, some bad there, but the Servlet 4 spec is good to go. What the Java EE 8 release told us was what was happening with the other specs. And historically, what would have happened, either they would have had a major update or they would have had a maintenance release. This time, basically nothing's changed at all. Which is good in the sense that it means we've got absolutely no development work to do. Certainly when Java EE 7 was released, there was a maintenance release for JSP that gave us, it wasn't much work, but it gave us a bit of work to do, just a few new configuration options that were added. But for Java EE 8, there's been no change at all for JSPs, expression language, WebSocket or JASPIC. Now the good news is that means Tomcat 9 is ready to go. We've implemented everything we want to implement, fantastic. The bad news is all of those annoying little edge cases and ambiguities that we were hoping to get some of clarified haven't been clarified. So again, swings and roundabouts. That last bullet point isn't strictly correct because the release that was in process I cancelled at about 1 o'clock this morning. And that's because we're dealing with some security vulnerabilities at the minute, and having reviewed the previous fix, we were okay, but it was sort of, well, it looks a little bit fragile. We'd rather have something that's we're a bit more confident of. We can't find a way of breaking it, but we're not convinced somebody won't be able to if they try hard enough, so we wanted to fix it in a different way so we can be more certain that they can't. So the commit for that went in this morning before I caught the train, and hopefully when I get home this evening we'll tag and start the release process for 9. Might be able to get the tag done while I'm here. We'll see how things go. 8.5 will follow quickly behind because that's a simple backport. 8 should also follow fairly quickly. 7, little trickier because the code changed a lot between 7 and 8, and it's a bit harder to backport, and we've got a regression to fix there as well. So there isn't actually a Tomcat 9 release in progress at the minute, but it will be soon. Other things that have happened over the last year, we've actually made some really good progress with fixing problems with the JRE. If I look back 4 or 5 years, if I found a bug in the JRE, I'd dutifully fill in the bug on bug form on Oracle's website. I'd get an email within a couple of minutes giving me a number, and then I'd hear nothing. Months literally would go past. If I was lucky, I'd get another email saying, yes, we've reviewed your bug report, it's valid, here's the public bug number, and it would be on the public bug tracker where it would sit, and nothing would happen. That was somewhat demotivating, particularly given the number of bugs that only got as far as getting an initial bug number and never made it to the public bug tracker. And these weren't, oh, I think there might be a bug here. These were, this is what it should do. This is what the documentation says should happen. This is a test case that proves that's not the case. This is clearly a bug. It needs fixing. It was about as clear as a bug report as it could get, and it was just nothing was happening. When when Oracle was starting to think about Java 9 becoming final, they reached out to a number of open source projects, Tomcat included, and they said, oh, please test Tomcat and Java 9. If there's any problems, please let us know. To which we've said, yeah, certainly, happy to, no problem. Oh, by the way, we've found some problems. If you could get them fixed for Java 9, that would be great. Oh, by the way, they also affect Java 8 and earlier, so if you could fix them there as well, that would be even better. And by that route, we got them all fixed. So the things we got fixed were UTF-8 handling. There was some issues with how invalid byte sequences were handled. Java would swallow a few more bytes than it should, and that would cause interoperability problems. Lots and lots of memory leaks have been fixed. Typically, the pattern for these was you'd call some JRE code, that under the covers, go through 3 or 4 classes, would ultimately end up in doing something that started a thread. If you'd made that call from your web application, the thread would be started, but its context class loader would be the web application class loader, because that's the current class loader. That would all be fine until you tried to undeploy the app, at which point the JRE thread would still be running. It would still have a reference to the web application class loader, which now can't be garbage collected. So you've got a whopping great big memory leak of the entire web app class loader and all of the classes it's ever loaded. That happens often enough. You'll get an out of memory error in PermGen, or at least you would in Java 8, when you try and reload your app again. But all the ones we know about those are fixed. We've also been able to fix a problem where trying to track down these memory leaks. If you had a memory leak that was caused by a static exception, and the way that happens is sometimes exceptions are expensive things to generate, and code that needs to throw them to indicate an error sometimes takes a shortcut and basically creates the exception on startup and then basically just rethrows the same exception over and over again. What happens when they do that, or what can happen if you're not very careful, is when the exception is created, it stores its stack trace. That stack trace doesn't just have textual references to all of the methods in the call stack, it actually has pointers to the methods in the classes. Those classes have pointers to their class loaders, and if you've got any web application call in there, again you've pinned the web application class loader in memory. The problem was normally you can use a profiler to find these memory leaks, and they're dead easy to track down. Static exceptions, it was just shown, no, there's no garbage collection route here. No, I will not garbage collect that web application class loader, but you trace the GC routes, nothing there. Couldn't figure out what was going on. With some help from the folks at YourKit, we tracked it down to a JVM bug, and it was actually a workaround for a much older bug that no longer applied, and they were basically deliberately blocking that reference so you couldn't follow it. So we got that fixed. Now you can follow the reference and you can actually find the memory leaks. So that was, again, more JRE bugs that have been fixed, but mostly with the help of Oracle, but that one with a little bit of help from YourKit as well. So we've made some progress on that. The next thing I wanted to look at was some metrics, and these are Tomcat bug counts. And I've got one graph for each of the major versions. So here we've got Tomcat 6. You'll notice that it tailed off when Tomcat reached end of life. We didn't just close them all as won't fix. We actually went through all of them. A small number of them had already been fixed. They were closed. Most of them were old enhancement requests that were in the category of, well, that's not an itch I feel like scratching right now, but it's a legitimate request, so we'll leave it there to see if somebody provides a patch at some point. They hadn't by the time we got to looking at them. Most of them we actually implemented. A few we said, well, actually that's quite the amount of work to implement that compared to the demand, not sure, and that got moved to a new Tomcat version, to a later version. But none of them, we didn't go through and just close stuff off. That's one thing we don't do. When I say Tomcat releases go out and we've fixed all of the bugs we know about, we do try and genuinely do that. We don't go through and say, oh, well, we haven't had an update on that for 4 weeks, I'm just going to close it. What we might say is, well, I can't reproduce that. I've looked all over the code that looks as if it might be responsible based on the pitifully little information that's been provided in the bug report. Really can't see any way of reproducing it. Can't find anything with code analysis. We've asked for more information and nothing's been forthcoming. There really is no hope of us ever doing anything more with this report. And at that point, yes, we will close it. Usually with a message saying, but if you come across this problem and you can recreate it, feel free to reopen it. So occasionally we do close bugs like that, but mostly we don't close stuff unless it has actually genuinely been fixed. And really what's worth noting here is the overall bug count. So Tomcat 6 peaked at 100 bugs, but that was quite a few years ago. Not sure if you can see the scale here, but that's back in 2010 or so. Typically Tomcat 6 hovered around 50 to 60 open bugs. Tomcat 7 is hovering around 40 to 50. 8 is very much the same. Had a bit of a spike, but it hovers between 40 and 50. 9 hasn't quite got there yet, but it's not as widely used. And the message that I'm trying to get across here is, if you look at typical projects that are Tomcat size and age, the open bug count is normally an awful lot higher. And we've put in quite a lot of effort into getting that bug count down, getting stuff fixed, and really working on the overall stability. So if I look at the last year, we've fixed around 300 bugs. And that's not 100 bugs times 3 different versions. That's 300 bugs times however many versions they were affected. So it's probably closer to 1,000 if you count each version as a separate bug. So it's 300 bugs that have been fixed, and if they've needed fixing across all versions, then we've backported the fix across all of them. In terms of currently open bugs, it's at the minute less than 10. I think it's 6, but it's certainly single digit. And those are actual bugs, so functionality that isn't working as intended. The other bugs, about 110 I think it is at the minute, those are enhancement requests. So the actual open bugs is a very small number, and they'll be open either because it's if we need a fix in a dependency that we don't directly control, although if it's an Apache project we can always of course go over and contribute a patch, and I think we've got at least one in that category where we need to do that fix. Some of them will be, from what we look at the report, that is a genuine bug. We are sure the bug report is correct. What we can't do is reproduce it. We haven't been able to find it by code inspection yet. So we leave it open for as long as it takes us to either figure out what the problem is or somebody to come up with a more reproducible test case. But those numbers, like I say, they're down in the single digits. There's another one where we're waiting for clarification from the servlet expert group, and that hasn't been forthcoming. So overall, the vast majority of the open bugs, they're enhancement requests. What we try and do is, if you've got a bug and it's reproducible, if you report it to us, say in February, hopefully it'll be fixed in the March release. So we do try and turn things around that quickly, and the better the bug report, the quicker that will happen. On a really good day, if you happen to catch it just right, and we have been able to fix bugs in less than an hour, but that normally means that I happen to look at my email, or one of us looks at our email at exactly the right time. The bug report is blindingly obvious. The patch is either provided or equally blindingly obvious, and we'll just commit it there and then. So we can turn it around really quickly, but typically it takes us a couple of weeks. But if you get the bug reports in, then they will get fixed. In terms of lines of code, Tomcat's about 125,000 lines, and that stayed pretty static, even though we've added a lot of new features in Tomcat 8, 5 and Tomcat 9. And the reason for that is we also spend time looking at the code, reviewing it, tidying it up where we can. So refactoring to reduce duplication. Recently we've managed to delete 3,000 lines from the JSP engine because it had an entire XML parser in there. Now that dates back to when XML parsers provided with the JRE were frankly atrocious, and you just couldn't rely on them, so we had to write our own. These days we've moved away from that. We use the one provided by the JRE, and actually those 3,000 lines of code, they were just doing one thing: determining the encoding of a JSP file. That was it. and that's rather a lot of code for just determining a file encoding. So that got dropped. We've replaced it with a simpler implementation. And we do continually review the code, looking for those sorts of opportunities, looking for where the JRE is providing us new features, so we can keep the code base relatively easy to maintain. And it's not, and it's certainly too big to keep all of it in memory, but certainly for the bits of code we touch on a fairly regular basis, then because I'm in it every day, then I know my way around that code pretty well. It's small enough that you can do it for most of it. Delve into, say, the details of the GSP engine, then you tend to spend a little bit of time figuring it out. But it's a relatively small code base, and it's relatively well maintained, and it's relatively easy to work with. And generally we're trying to improve that gradually over time. Now, we have had a few hiccups over the last year, and hands up, most of these, if not all of these, have been my fault. I'll start with request line validation. Now, this started off as a security vulnerability report. You could, if you put characters into the request line that weren't meant to be there, then Tomcat would misinterpret them and end up generating requests that it shouldn't. That can cause problems, particularly when behind a reverse proxy. So we thought, well, we could just block those characters. We know which ones are causing this problem. They're dead easy to filter out. But that feels a little bit like playing whack-a-mole, because if we do that, the chances are, give it a couple of weeks and somebody will have found a different character that does a similar thing and we'll have another vulnerability to fix. So the right way to do it will be to go back to the specs, work out what's allowed there, and block everything that isn't. Which is what we did. And that worked very well. It blocked everything that shouldn't have been there. Unfortunately, there are an awful lot of clients out there that don't follow the specs very well. So, for example, the first group of people that were jumping up and down screaming were the people that were sending data in query strings, and they had parameters with multiple values, and they were separating those values with the pipe character. That's okay as long as you remember to encode the pipe character, because it's not allowed to appear unencoded in a URL. Most clients don't. So that was our first problem. And we ummed and ahed, and part of me thinks, look, it's not like the spec's new. It's been around for a while. Really, that's a client problem. It's not Tomcat's problem. But equally, we have sympathy for the view that, well, yes, but there are an awful lot of clients out there and upgrading them isn't easy. So for that, we relaxed the validation and basically made it optional that you could optionally allow the pipe character if you wanted. So things went quiet for a few days. Then everybody that uses JSON piped up, because JSON uses an awful lot of curly brackets, and people like putting that in query strings as well. And curly brackets is another character that's not allowed in a URI. So then all the JSON people were jumping up and down, and again, curly brackets are now on the list of allowed characters. In fact, we had a comment on the bug report for this particular issue overnight that the carrot character somebody wanted to add, and it's a balance, because the more of these we add, potentially there's a security risk. But at the same time, I have a lot of sympathy for the view that, look, it's my system. If I want to do something to deliberately make it insecure, I know what I'm doing. Please let me do it and get out of my way. I've got a good reason for doing it. And to be fair, I've been in exactly that boat myself when I've been looking for old versions of OpenSSL to test with, because I need to reproduce a problem that's been fixed in a later version. But at the time, the distributor of OpenSSL binaries for Windows, where I was testing, only provided the latest version on the grounds that you should never be using an old version because they're insecure. Well, yes, but I know what I'm doing and I need the old version. These days I just build it myself. But so I have sympathy for that view of, well, yes, I know you're blocking it for security reasons, but I've got an equally good reason for why I need to do it. So I think we're probably going to end up relaxing that quite a bit more than we have at the minute. But that's a discussion that I need to start on the dev list. So that was that one. The next one was HTTP reason phrase. This started when I was doing the HTTP 2 implementation, because HTTP 2 doesn't have a reason phrase, it just has the response code. And I thought, well, that's nice, because there's a little bit of ugly code. It's not much, it's only about 10 lines or so, but it's a bit ugly, and I've never really liked it. for handling the reason phrase. It'd be really good if I could get rid of it. Oh well, one day when HTTP 2's taken over the world, I'll be able to do that. So I happened to be looking at the updated HTTP 1.1 spec about a week or so later and noticed, ooh, it says the reason phrase is optional. Ah, now I could get rid of it. Yeah, but, well, the new version of the spec's fairly new, and I bet you lots of clients haven't updated. I'll just go and check what RFC 2616 says. Oh, it says the reason phrase is option as well. Fantastic. The spec has been in place for ages. It must be safe to drop the reason phrase. I can get rid of that really ugly code that I don't like. Then the people who had to maintain the server-side application that was talking to an embedded controller in cars that they couldn't update, that was hard-coded to look for the response phrase 200 OK, started complaining. And when we said, well, the client's broken, well, yes, it is, but we can't upgrade it. Hang on, you've deployed code to cars, millions of them, and there's not an upgrade path. Well, there is if they take it into the dealer. Okay. They didn't say. To be honest, I suspect they're all pretty much the same. Now, I accept that doing over-the-air updates has its own set of risks, and that is there's a whole bunch of different security problems with that, but I really don't think it's a problem you can just ignore in that space. If you're deploying software to anything, whether it's cars, any IoT device, you are going to need to update it at some point, and there needs to be a realistic plan for doing that, not a, yes, we'll return 2 million devices to the manufacturer and reflash it ourselves. That's not going to cut it. So anyway, the HTTP reason phrase is now optional, disabled by default in later versions, enabled by default in older ones. And the final one was the cookie spec. Now, the cookie specs have been a disaster for years. I got myself very, very badly burnt and didn't make myself at all popular a few years ago now, when, again, starting with the security vulnerability to do with cookie handling, I thought, I know, we'll correctly implement the specs. Tomcat did so, and we had to add about 15 different configuration options to work around all the different varieties of broken client that there are out there. And generally, it was just a complete mess. So the solution that was proposed was, well, the browsers are mostly doing the same thing, so let's just document the current behavior and we'll call that the spec. Then at least the spec and the current behavior will agree. Now, it's not ideal, but it's better than what we had, and out of that we got RFC 6265, which Tomcat then implemented and enabled by default in 8.5 onwards, I believe. It was mostly all well and good, but there's a couple of edge cases with Internet Explorer. RF 6265 basically says when you set a domain on a cookie, servers must not include the leading dot. Clients should ignore it if it's provided, i.e. requires it in some cases, and Tomcat never sends it. In fact, Tomcat complains bitterly if you try and set it. So we had to relax that. And all of that brings me to the next potential hiccup that we're trying to avoid, which is hostname validation. At the moment, Tomcat will let you set pretty much whatever you like as long as it's a valid HTTP header in the hostname. Hostnames are actually a lot stricter than that. They've basically got to be a valid DNS name, valid IPv4 or valid IPv6. Anything else is not legal. So we have written a whole bunch of code that will do that validation. We are not going to enable it by default. What we are going to do is when it is plumbed in, it will be plumbed in and it will log by default. It will log a big, fat, ugly warning. And that will let us get a sense of, well, is there a problem out there? If so, how big is it? And that will dictate where we go from there. Where I think we'll end up is it'll be enabled by default on the most recent version. It'll warn by default, probably not very loudly on older versions, and there'll still be an option to disable it completely if you want. It's probably going to be the sort of thing where people are going to take a long time to fix all of the various broken clients that this is going to identify. But the idea is we're going to learn the lessons from the other hiccups and not just say, oh yes, it's a spec, surely all the clients will follow it, and just deploy it. We'll do it more gradually with warnings to start with. Given the happenings of the last week or so, it's certainly worth talking about security. I'll get to the most recent stuff at the end, just what's been going on in the last year or so. We did make a couple of mistakes with the refactoring, both around send file and in byte buffer. The bad aspect of that was the vulnerabilities they opened up was response swapping. So one user would see another user's response. That's generally pretty bad. The mitigating factor was that the user had no way to control it. So I couldn't say, I want to see that user's response. I just had to send a request, and sometimes I might get a different response back, but you had no control over what that response was. So it was hard to do a targeted attack, but it was certainly leaking information that should have been private. Those have obviously all been fixed. The new code, there's lots of scope for denial of service attacks in HTTP 2. We blocked a reasonable proportion of them in the first iteration, but we didn't catch all of them. And there was a bug in error handling that meant there was a very, very easy denial of service attack there as well. They've now all been patched. Java deserialization hasn't bitten us that badly. There are certainly apps out there that have been hit very badly by Java deserialization, because essentially what it ends up allowing is remote code execution. So Tomcat, once the Java deserialization bug started being discussed again more widely at the beginning of last year, we basically did a code review and we went through all of the places where Tomcat serializes or deserializes and worked out what could go wrong here, have we got the protection in place. And generally we hadn't, but the way you could exploit it was essentially limited to if you had an untrusted application running on Tomcat under a security manager, you could use the Java deserialization, effectively bypass the security manager and do whatever you liked. But that was something that the developer of the untrusted app could do. It wasn't anything a remote user could trigger. So it was limited to a fairly small use case, and not that many of our users run under a security manager. And those that do, have we been locked in? Oh, there we go, thank you. Those that do run under a security manager, they're few and far between. But we fixed the deserialization issues, essentially put the protection there to stop that particular sandbox escape. There are a couple of other vulnerabilities that were of a similar nature. I think there's one via expression language. I forget what the other one was. I think resource handling. But they're all basically security manager bypass. Now, generally, most people, if they're running an untrusted app, the approach they take is, look, yes, I know I can sandbox it with the security manager in Tomcat, but actually most apps really don't like running under a security manager. It's easier just to stick it in a VM or some sort of container and isolate that at that level, rather than trying to isolate it within the Java process. We do try and support that within Tomcat, but it's hard. I wouldn't be overly surprised if there were other ways of escaping the sandbox that we haven't found yet. And as I say, getting an app to run under a security manager is a lot of hard work anyway. There are probably better solutions to that. Error dispatching, that was a fun one. If a servlet experiences an error and triggers the error handling mechanism, it's basically handled as a forward, and that's mandated by the spec. So what that means is the original request gets forwarded to the error page, and it gets forwarded as is. Now, if it's a GET request, the error page sees a GET request and returns a response, and that's fine. But it might not be a GET request. It might be a delete or a put or something else. And when that's forwarded to the error page, if the error page is a static page that's handled by Tomcat's default servlet, and the default servlet is configured to allow reading and writing as well as reading, then what you could do was you could basically overwrite or modify or even delete the existing error pages. So it was a way of sort of uploading static content to a site that you weren't meant to be able to. So that's been fixed. Cause, that was just a missing HTTP header, so I think there were cache issues with that. Which brings me on to the fun ones, 12, 16 through 15 through 17. So a couple of weeks ago, we got a responsibly reported security vulnerability to do with how Tomcat 7 and Windows was handling the security checks we do to make sure that all of the security constraints have been applied. Because because everything in the servlet world is case sensitive. So the request URL is case sensitive, the security constraints are case sensitive, but the Windows file system isn't. So there's a potential gap there where if you modify the case of the file you're requesting, it doesn't match the security constraint, but it still matches the file system, because the file system isn't case sensitive. So you can bypass security constraints. The other thing you can normally do is do source code disclosure on a JSP. So Tomcat has a bunch of checks that are eventually meant to stop that and effectively make the check case sensitive. And somebody had found a way around this by appending, I think it was a space to the end of the file name. And that wasn't handled quite right. So we'd fixed it. We did what we usually do, which is look more broadly what else could go wrong here, and we found some other places in Tomcat 7's virtual directory context implementation. Now that's mainly a developer tool, but some people use it in production, and again there were other ways that you could bypass security constraints, look at source code, so we fixed all of those as well. So the first one was 12.6.15. The virtual directory context was 12.6.16. That all got fixed and announced. Everything was happy. Then I think it was last Sunday morning, I woke up to about 4 emails on the security mailing list, all from China, all saying we found a bypass to 12.6.15. Now, to get 4 reports on the mailing list is unusual. To get 4 reports on the same issue is unheard of. 4 reports on the same issue, all from Chinese security researchers, and I begin to think, yeah, somebody's gone public with this somewhere, probably on a Chinese blog or something, and it looked like people were trying to claim credit. Oh, great! What have we missed? I wish we'd caught it. Kicking myself, thinking, what have I missed? Looks like we're going to have to do another set of releases. Well, let's look into it. We might be able to wait a month and do it in the normal release cycle. Then I go and look at the dev list and find out that one of these people has reported it publicly in Bugzilla, at which point we have no choice but to deal with it and deal with it as soon as we can. So what we've been doing for the last week is we went public, I think it was on the Monday, basically said, yep, there's this vulnerability, disable read-only or set read-only to true on the default servlet and you won't be affected. It does affect all Tomcat versions, it does affect all platforms. We're working on a fix. And we've gone through a couple of iterations and we've had some additional security reports, in fact over this weekend, where what happened was they found a different way of bypassing this vulnerability. The good news is the fix we applied to this actually blocks it. But it was a little bit more by luck than judgment. It blocks it. We can't see a way around it, but it doesn't block it where we wanted to block it. And the code that actually blocks it was never intended to block it. So it's not vulnerable, but we'd like to have a slightly more robust fix in place. So that I committed last night. Konstantin reviewed it for me. He found the same problem that my CI build found, that I'd missed a array index error, so that's been fixed. He also found an optimization that's been applied, that got committed first thing this morning. So the plan is to run the tests tag, start the release hopefully tonight. That'll get backported to 8 as well, 8.5 and 8.0. 7 will take a little bit longer. That should be able to get done hopefully tomorrow. So that set of releases is in progress. Luckily for you and unluckily for my stress levels, what you're getting to see is basically how we fix security vulnerabilities, but it's in public for once. We don't like doing it this way because we have to do things more quickly, which tends to mean we don't have as much time to review stuff, so sometimes we miss stuff. So you get to see the really ugly version where we have to iterate over the fix a few times until we get the right one. Normally it would all be done in private. The Tomcat committers would look at it, we'd review it over time, we'd find the problems then and then commit the final fix. But as I say, hopefully that should be out there end of this week. The bad news with these is, yes, it is remote code execution, because effectively it lets you upload a JSP and then execute it. The good news is that you have to have the default servlet configured read-only equals false. So the default servlet has to be configured for read-write. That in itself is a pretty rare thing to do. It's even rarer to do it on a public-facing site. Where we do see it, it tends to be done on an intranet. And it's never done without putting it behind some form of authentication, because you do not want a public-facing web server that anybody can upload anything to. That's just asking for trouble. So yes, it's a problem. Yes, it's important, but it's not critical, because it's not something that we would expect most, or in fact pretty much any public-facing site to deal with. So that is in hand. So that's sort of what's been happening over the last year or so. I'm quickly going to talk about future plans. I'm not going to cover it in much detail, because Remy's going to cover it in more detail in his session. The big thing that's happened in the last month or so is that Oracle have announced that they're donating Java EE to the Eclipse Foundation. I was I was the person at Apache that Oracle were talking to about possibly donating it to Apache. I'm not surprised it ended up at Eclipse, basically because the microprofile was already there. And Oracle were talking to both Red Hat and IBM, who are big commercial contributors to the Java EE ecosystem as a whole, and they were already collaborating on the Java EE microprofile at Eclipse. It looked almost from the get-go that Eclipse was where it was going to end up. And that's before you get into discussions of whether Eclipse lets commercial organizations have more commercial control over the project or not compared to Apache. Just because they already had a base there, it looked like the natural destination. The good news is that means that the TCKs, the test and compatibility kits, are going to be open sourced. We haven't had direct access to those for quite some time. And that's all to do with a little licensing disagreement that Apache and Oracle had, and Sun before that had, which I will happily fill you in on the details if you like that sort of thing, but it will take a while, so I won't bore you with it now. But essentially, we haven't had access to the TCKs, but they are going to be open sourced, so we will have access to them. The plan, as Oracle have explained it, is they want to take everything that's been used for Java EE8, basically transfer it all to Eclipse, and basically re-release Java EE8 as TBD 1.0. So it's basically demonstrating that everything's transferred, and they can produce a release, turn the handle, get that release out. And the idea is that the TBD 1.0 will pass all of the official Java EE8 TCKs. Equally, Java EE8 will pass all of the TBD 1.0 TCKs. So they are meant to be equivalent. Effectively, it's a demonstrate that we've transferred all of this Java EE8 stuff to Eclipse, and you can still produce something that looks like Java EE8. We're just not going to let you call it Java EE8. When I spoke to Oracle, they were pretty clear that the word Java wasn't going to appear in the primary part of the name. It wasn't going to be Java something. It might possibly have been something for Java. That was TBD. The sense I get from the community is the community would like it to be Java something. They'd like Java to be more prominent in the name. Whether or not Oracle will allow that, I suspect not, but they might relent. We shall see. Once TBD 1.0 has been released, then TBD 2.0 will be developed under Eclipse's processes, and anything that is currently planned to be in Java EE9, it will land in TBD 2.0, assuming whoever was planning on implementing that feature is happy going and implementing it at Eclipse. Oracle have been quite clear they don't plan on continuing Java EE. They will support all of their current customers using it, but they're not planning on continuing Java EE development internally. They are effectively stopping that ongoing development and directing that towards Eclipse. What that means for Tomcat, well, Tomcat 10 was going to be aligned to Java EE9. I imagine that Tomcat 9 is obviously targeted at Java EE8. My expectation at this point is that Tomcat 9 will also support TBD 1.0, and Tomcat 10 will be aligned with TBD 2.0. but that future direction is rather uncertain, particularly because you won't necessarily have an overarching project setting the overall direction for whatever TBD becomes. In Java EE, you had Oracle setting that direction, you had the overall platform spec setting the direction for all the other specs. That's less likely to happen at Eclipse, or we don't know how that's going to happen. So whether there is an overall TBD 2.0 or whether the individual specs then evolve individually with a much looser cooperation, just don't know. But Tomcat 10 will be that ever next thing, whatever that looks like. Whether we end up with some other relationship between Tomcat major versions and Java EE technologies, we shall have to see. So essentially we don't have any firm plans for Tomcat 10 at the minute. Things that have been discussed, reactive programming comes up a few times. We have already made some changes internally to Tomcat to make it easier to implement reactive APIs. Reactive programming was talked about in Servlet 4, but in the end wasn't implemented. So I imagine there'll be something in that direction, but I don't know exactly what. We've also talked about removing the API native connector in Tomcat 10, and I think there's general agreement amongst the committers that that's a good idea. And the reason for that is API mainly exists because it gives you access to OpenSSL, and OpenSSL is a lot faster than JSSE for TLS in most combinations. If you try really hard, you can find the odd combination where JSSE is comparable or a little bit faster, but generally OpenSSL is much better. Now, as of Tomcat 8.5, you can now take OpenSSL and use that to do just the encryption bit with JSSE. So you don't need the full API native connector where the API handles all the low-level I/O as well. So there's much less of a need for API native. It also makes the breadth of the native code you have to work with a lot narrower. It makes that native API a lot simpler, less prone to bugs, easier to maintain, and generally the need for API goes away if you can plug OpenSSL into NI or NIO2, and it's never quite been as stable as NIO. So from that point of view, I think it does make sense to remove it. So that brings me to the end of what I wanted to talk about. As I said, Remy is going to be talking next, and he'll talk a little bit more detail about future plans and other ideas, and in a little bit more depth about some of the newer features that are already available. But before I bring mine to a close, does anybody have any questions? Deathly silence throughout the room.
Yes.
Remy.
So Eclipse will get a new TCK for EE. That's interesting, but basically everyone will discover how hard it is to actually run the TCK and pass it. That will be quite a fun endeavor for everyone, I think.
Yes. For those of us that have had access to the TCKs or have had access to them through work, they're not as good as you probably think they are. There are huge gaps in the functionality coverage, and there are a few places where I think it's just plain wrong. But as I don't officially have access to the TCK, I can't officially challenge it, and I can't do anything about it yet. But certainly the development of the TCK is very much aligned to how Glassfish does stuff, and that tends to be the base. Rather than what does the spec say, it's what does Glassfish do, and if what Glassfish does and what the spec says isn't quite aligned, or if there's scope for interpretation, then there are sometimes issues with the TCK. But saying that, there are people in the Tomcat community that take Tomcat, incorporate it into their own products, and then run the TCKs against it. So we have been getting bug reports of TCK failures just indirectly. So I'm reasonably confident that when we get access to the TCKs, then certainly apart from the stuff that's new in Servlet 4, I'm pretty confident we'll pass most of it. The Servlet 4 stuff, we'll just have to wait and see. We do run other test kits. There's a WebSocket test kit by Autobahn that's very good. Tomcat runs against that and passes everything. There's also a HTTP2 test kit that the first time I ran against it, there was lots of horrible red, but now we're passing everything. So where there are, actually we do one for WebDAV as well, although I haven't run that for a while. So where there are these other test kits, we do run those as well, and generally, if we run it, Tomcat will keep fixing Tomcat till it passes. But yeah, we shall see what happens with the TCK. It's going to be interesting times for Java EE. Yes?
You mentioned the Oracle approached you for the feedback about Java 9, and you managed to get some bugs fixed.
Yep.
In a case. Were those fixed in Java 9, or they were backported to Java 8?
They were fixed in Java 9. They were backported to Java 8 as well. We even managed to get a new feature added to Java 9 around. There's a memory leak in terms of file descriptors around URL handling for jars. Essentially, by default, it will cache it and keep the file open, which causes all sorts of problems if you're trying to reload a web app and actually delete the jar files, particularly on Windows. And prior to Java 9, you could either turn caching off for everything or on for everything. And what we wanted was, we just want to turn it off for jar files. It's fine for everything else. It's just jar files that are the problem. And actually now you can do it for, they've added to the API so you can do it for jar files as well, but that was added in 9. But all of the bugs, they got backported to the latest Java 8. Java 7 had already gone past end of life by then. I suspect if you're paying for commercial support for Java 7, then those fixes made it into the commercially supported Java 7 as well, but I don't know. But certainly everything we had reported got backported to 8. Unfortunately, we have to work on Tomcat has to work on the basis that Tomcat 9 has to work on the basis you could be running on any Java 8 version, so we can't assume you're running on the fixed version. So we had to keep all of our workarounds in place. But for Tomcat 10, because everything got fixed early in Java 9 before the first official release, we'll be able to ditch all of that, which will be great. Okay, I am pretty much at the end of my time, so thank you very much for your attention.